While its name translates to the humble log island, the Scandinavian capital is quite grand in its architecture, its monarchy, and its history. Welcome to Stockholm.
Remember when you were a child and all you asked was why? Well, I never quite outgrew that whole quest for knowledge phase. In fact, I've made a career out of asking who, what, where, why, and how as an arts and travel journalist for the past 20 years. So, if I have an insatiable curiosity about the exciting, inspiring, beautiful world of art, architecture, and hidden history all around us, I bet you do too. This isn't your typical what to do on a vacation travel show. Oh no, this is your all-access pass to a deeper understanding of the world's great art and architecture, people and places, history, and how did they do that. So, come along on our educational journey, our field trip for grown-ups who have never quite grown up, and learn on Curious Traveler.
Since the Vikings in 1000 AD to a tiny medieval village called Gamla Stan, since 1252, Stockholm has had so much to be curious about. Salutos faviata!
Stockholm is, of course, the capital of Sweden, but it is also regarded as the capital of all of Scandinavia. And it all started in the Middle Ages with a dude named Birger Jarl, considered the founder of Stockholm. And Stockholm isn't just one spot of land, it's actually spread out over many islands, so its waterways and bridges are just as iconic as its architecture. Speaking of its architecture, Stockholm became a major European power in the 17th century, which is why many of its important buildings look the way that they do. So here's what I'm curious about in Stockholm. Why was the city named Log Island? What the heck is Gamla Stan, and why does it look like a storybook? Who was Queen Christina, and why did she get such a fancy throne? How did the long Swedish winters create this cheery symbol of Sweden? What is Versailles doing all the way up here in Scandinavia? Who is not buried in this church, and why? How did the Nobel Prize come to be? Why is there grass on this roof? And finally, why is there one really important Roman emperor missing from the bow of this ship? Who, what, where, why, and how? So, Stockholm is a floating city, spread out over those many islands. But there's one island that stands out above the rest because it is where Stockholm began, here on the island of Stadsholmen.
These quaint, windy, and cobblestone streets are all part of historic Gamla Stan. Now, Gamla Staden translates into Old Town, and that's exactly what this is. In fact, it is one of the oldest and best preserved medieval towns in all of Europe. Gamla Stan also happens to be where Stockholm began back in 1252. That is also the curious reason why you will see 1252 along a lot of the storefronts today.
But why did Stockholm start exactly here? Well, for the same reason Stockholm means Log Island. Because of a wonderful legend that says the people of the old capital of Sweden were looking for a new, safe place to live. So they simply filled a log with gold and let it float, you know, as you do. When it landed here at Stadsholmen, they saw it as a sign that this was their peaceful new home. And fortunately, much of that 13th century storybook village remains, with beautiful cobblestone streets, wonky medieval alleys, beautiful medieval and Renaissance architecture, and lots of quaint town squares. Gamla Stan later expanded into 3 surrounding islands: Riddarholmen, Strömsborg, and Helgeandsholmen. Yes, I practiced saying that last one.
Also in Gamla Stan, you will find one of the oldest buildings in all of Stockholm, the majestic Riddarholm Church. Parts of it still date back to the 13th century. And of course, it is known for that majestic cast iron spire that just reaches into the heavens. It is also known as the final resting place for the Swedish monarchs.
Riddarholm Church is Stockholm's only preserved medieval monastery church. It was built between 1270 and 1300 for the Franciscan monastery. Outside, that beautiful, twisting cast iron spire was added in the 1800s. Inside, it originally had 2 naves and cobblestones on the floor. But today, you will see there are 3 naves and grave slabs from different time periods embedded directly into the floor. But the most important aspect to this historic church is that it has been the official burial church for Swedish monarchs since the Middle Ages. One of those kings is Gustavus Adolphus, and he had a famous ship that we'll learn about later. He also had a famous daughter named Christina. While she too was a Swedish monarch, she is not buried here at Riddarholmen Church for a very curious reason. And to find out why, we go just around the corner to visit Christina's throne in Sweden's royal palace. Built in the Baroque style by Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, the royal palace is laid out like a Roman palace, fit for an emperor, with hundreds of gloriously gilded rooms. And in one of those rooms, we find Queen Christina's silver throne. Here in the Hall of State, you will find the very regal throne of the Swedish monarchy. It was designed in the 1640s for Queen Christina. And believe it or not, every year since then, the king or the queen sat right here in this hall for the opening ceremony of Parliament. And it lasted all the way until 1974. Queen Christina was a fascinating woman, the only surviving heir of Gustav Adolphus. She was actually allowed to be educated as a man. Can you believe it? This, of course, was quite unusual for the 1600s. In fact, she goes down in history as one of the most educated women of her time. Indeed. And created a social circle of scholars and great thinkers, instead of gossipy ladies who lunch. Did you see what she was wearing? She is said to have wanted to create Stockholm as the Athens of the North. That's all a good thing, right? Well, in those times, a lady who didn't act like a traditional lady, especially a queen, made her not so popular. She refused to get married. Legend has it that she even dressed in men's clothes and rarely brushed her hair. Oh, the horror. So, when she refused to marry and therefore refused to produce an heir to carry on the royal lineage, this, of course, caused a scandal. She eventually abdicated the throne and moved to Rome, converted to Roman Catholicism, and lived her own life on her own terms. Of course, there were a few bumps in the road for her there too, but eventually, when Christina died, she became one of the few women ever buried in the Vatican. How's that for a story in girl power? To go through all that drama instead of just dressing up like a fairy tale queen and sitting pretty on her pretty throne. I like it. Now to explore more pretty little and big details of the royal palace. How many rooms total in the palace? How many floors and wings? It seems to be never ending.
Yeah, it is. Depends on what you call a room. The official number is 608 rooms, but if you like, you can probably go up to about 1,500 rooms or areas. There's a lot of art and furniture, different styles, probably from the 17th century, 16th, 17th century actually.
But the royal palace didn't start off so grand. Remember Birger Jarl?
Hello.
The founder of Stockholm? Well, historians say his fortress was built right here where the palace now stands.
Wow.
And bits of that original castle survive underneath today's version, which is a Baroque beauty thanks to an artsy architect and a royal rivalry with a sunny French king.
This room was made by an architect called Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, and he was, as you can see, inspired by Versailles in France, in Paris. It's more or less a copy of the mirrored hall in Versailles.
Now, Versailles was, of course, the legendary pleasure palace of the legendary French king Louis XIV, the Sun King. But the King of Sweden was not about to be outshined by that Sun King. So he copied parts of his palace and...
All throughout the palace, you will see stars, just like this one. Why? Well, in the 17th century, Karl XI decided he was going to outdo Louis XIV, the Sun King. How do you outshine the sun? Well, old Karl decided the sun sets, but the North Star never does, right? So this North Star that you see today, that has been the symbol of the Swedish monarchy ever since.
And today, it stands as a wonderful reminder of a celestial-level battle of royal egos. Next, from Renaissance-style trash talk to a peaceful escape in the palace's stunning royal chapel. How heavenly is this? The royal chapel is a Baroque beauty with angelic white marble, anchored by mighty Corinthian columns, capped in glittering gold, adorned with sculptures that inspire, and little cherubs who giggle. It all leads to a soaring altar, and when you gaze heavenward, you are rewarded with beautifully painted ceilings and archways. All this glorious art you see today is thanks to the creativity of that Nicodemus Tessin the Younger. He did the drawings and the planning for the chapel. Then, only the finest artists and craftsmen were chosen to create this work of art that you can stand in. But this isn't the first version of the royal chapel. All this beauty came to be after the Great Fire of 1697, when the chapel had to be rebuilt. So, the history of this glorious chapel goes back a few centuries more.
Ever since the 1200s, there has always been some sort of royal chapel to accompany the royal palace. The version you see today was built in the 1700s. But throughout its history, while the chapel, of course, was created for the royal family, it has always been open to the people of Sweden and for anyone who wants to worship here.
And that message of unity continues outside the royal palace, which is just as fascinating as the interior. The western facade was known as the king's facade, or masculine side. The east facade was the queen's, or feminine side. And the south side represents the nation. So in all, the royal palace is a mini version of Sweden, with the royal family and its people united as one.
Wow!
And it's so amazing to me that all of this is so accessible to the public.
The kings were concerned to show the cultural inheritance of Sweden and the royal families to the public.
Next, from royal palace to royal prowess, we continue our exploration of the Vasa monarchy from land to sea. Okay, remember Queen Christina, the smarty pants who wanted to wear men's pants? Well, her father was King Gustavus Adolphus, and in 1626 he built the most expensive, the largest, and the most powerful warship in the land. Well, he thought it was the largest and most powerful warship in the land, except that just a few minutes into its maiden voyage, it sank, just a few yards offshore from the royal palace.
Vasa never made it out of the harbor. Vasa sank after 20 minutes because of faulty design. The thing is, Vasa was one of the very first two-deckers, and the people building it had very little experience. And unfortunately, they missed the position of the center of gravity by about a meter, which is not a lot, but enough to make Vasa capsize in the harbor.
And there it lay in Stockholm harbor for more than 300 years, until it was dredged up, restored, and then had an entire museum built around it. Hooray! So now today, we can revel in its massive size and its beautiful, intricate carvings.
You have about 700 carvings all around the ship, and most of them have a meaning. Some of them serious, some of them more humorous. You have a Triton wearing a Catholic priest's bonnet, for example, poking fun at the Catholics. Vasa was built during a time when Sweden was at war against Poland and Lithuania, so we also have a carving of a Polish nobleman crawling under a table right here at the bow. So trying to poke fun at at the poles.
And there are other carvings solely dedicated to the king's ego.
Yes, quite. Yes.
King Gustav Adolphus was known as the warrior king who made Sweden a great power. He was compared with Alexander the Great. And yeah, all this adoration went to his head.
Gustav Adolf II, or Gustav II Adolf, as he was known, he was nicknamed, or he came to be nicknamed the Lion of the North, and he very much liked that nickname, so he used it a lot. And you have lions pretty much everywhere on the ship.
A lot of the sort of Renaissance era, middle-aged kings like to compare themselves to Roman emperors, and that's exactly what's happening here.
They do, and Gustav Adolf is no exception.
All along the beakhead, you can see these male figures. Those actually are the Roman emperors, all placed in chronological order, except one, Augustus. The reason for that is historians say that King Gustavus of Sweden thought himself a Roman emperor, and in fact, just like Augustus. So that is why that figure is missing and replaced by the lion on the bow of the ship, the symbol of Gustavus. Here's where it gets even better, though. If you take an anagram of Augustus, you get Gustavus. Ooh.
And what could be more fitting to keep up here with the revered Roman emperors and Swedish kings? The toilets, of course. Yep, look closely at these rectangular slots, and that is where the would flush out to the sea. And that is also where we get the name head for toilets, from the beakhead.
Ta-da!
All right, stinky history over. Now let's move on to something a bit more inspiring. So, back to the heart of Gamla Stan we go, inside a beautiful 18th century building, where in one small space, you will find hundreds of geniuses permanently just hanging out.
Hello.
This is the Nobel Museum, dedicated to the contributions to humanity in physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, economics, literature, and of course, peace.
One of them famously went to Albert Einstein in 1921 in physics. Want to guess what he did with his prize money? He bought a house.
Well, not a house for himself, but for his ex-wife, so she could rent it out for income, the details of which are found here in this handwritten letter. He asked in return that he get to see a photo of the house she purchased, as it was, quote, the visible result of his musings. But how did the Nobel Prize begin back in 1901? Well, because of a Stockholm-born genius's guilt. So who was Alfred Nobel? Well, he was a wealthy, cosmopolitan, restless genius. Of his many inventions was a more powerful form of dynamite. That is why in his later years, he regretted the invention of this deadly weapon. And in his will, he created the Nobel Prize in pursuit of peace. So when Alfred Nobel passed away in 1896, his famous will stated that his fortune be given out in annual prizes to humanitarian world leaders and pioneers in the different categories. No other prize had attempted and now accomplished so much. Our final curiosity takes us to the island of Djurgården and takes us back in time, too, to Sweden in the early 16th through 20th centuries, when the different regions of Sweden dressed in different folk costumes and celebrated with different dances like these, all in celebration of the Sami or Laplander culture. This is Skansen, known as one of the world's oldest open-air museums, founded in 1891. It's a miniature historical Sweden full of traditional buildings, farmsteads, and churches, like this one.
This is the wonderful Saglora Church, built in 1729, with all kinds of interesting features in here. Right in front of me, this is a candle holder. Seems pretty simple, right? Well, actually, this tells you that this is where a wealthy person would sit, because they were the only ones that could afford candles. Up above me, we have these beams stretching across from one side to the next, all decorated with arcanthus flowers. And last but not least, all along the ceiling, there's this gorgeous painting of the heavens, and in the center, there's a triangle with the name of God in Hebrew letters.
Now, what to wear to church? Well, that all depends on how much sunlight your region gets.
What a beautiful costume you're wearing. What time period is it from? What region is it from?
Thank you. It comes from Dalecarlia, and it's a party costume for the big parties during the 18th and 19th century. Then you had the finest scarf and the nicest apron, and of course a lot of hand embroideries. During winter time you had long time to do in the darkness, to sit there and sew and do the embroideries.
Why sitting in the darkness? Well, because of the long winters in the Dalecarlia region. Geography has a lot to do with the costumes. Where the winters were longer, you were stuck indoors with nothing to do, so the ladies would create intricate embroideries to pass the time. But what to sew? Well, of course, the flowers that grew in Dalecarlia.
It's a special type of flower that's used up in Dalecarlia, the Kurbitz type of flower, and also that comes on the Dalecarlian horse.
What's a Dala horse? Oh, just a global symbol of Sweden. So during those long Swedish winters, wood carvers would carve these little wooden Dala horses for their children to play with. Later, these beautiful little toys were sold and bartered and actually became a source of income for the poorer families. Then the Dala horse became so popular that it was displayed at the World Expo in Paris in 1937 and the World's Fair in New York in 1939. And today it is a global symbol of Sweden.
Ta-da!
All that because there was no Netflix to kill the boredom on dark winter nights. Next, we explore the Hornborga cottage, lived in by several generations in the 18th century, with a curiously small doorway.
The fine thing is that you have such a small door
It's so
to keep
small.
your costs down for the heating. Also, people wear shorter in the 18th century. It's 150 centimeters. And people wear like 150 centimeters
My
during the
height,
18th
it was great,
century.
worked real well.
From tiny doorways on the ground to a curious material on the rooftop.
If you were living in a poor environment, you couldn't afford like, a big fancy thatched roof. You just let the grass grow on top.
Nobody was getting up there with a lawnmower to cut the
No,
grass.
no.
You wanted it to grow.
Yes,
Be better.
exactly. And you can enjoy sometimes flowers. You had
Yeah.
the wildflowers on top, or you could pick them also, and you had them on, just a decoration on your roof.
That's a fairy
So-
tale house to have flowers just
Exactly.
growing out of your roof.
Yes.
And a happy fairy tale ending has to keep the bad guys away, which is why the traditional Swedish cottage had this traditional do not enter tree right by the door.
It's called a lovage tree or bush, and it was regarded as a protection for the family, or a guard by the door, keeping away elves and dwarves and trolls and everything, making happy and good living for the family.
So Sweden really is the land of fairy tales, with flowers on the rooftops, doorways the perfect height for hobbits, but a no welcome mat for those elves, trolls, and dwarves. From a floating log filled with gold that determined the site of a new city, to a glorious final resting place of Swedish monarchs, except a certain queen who liked to dress more like a king, to the royal palace whose opulence rivaled Versailles, but was never too lofty for its people, to a powerful warship dedicated to the Lion of the North, who sadly couldn't swim. To a Swedish horse who traveled around the world, inspired by a humble Swedish flower, and sewn simply because the sun wouldn't shine. To a shrine built by a man who regretted his invention, so left an incentive for a more peaceful world as his legacy. Stockholm has so much to be curious about.
Thank you for joining us on our educational journey, and hopefully now you're even more curious about the who, what, where, why, and how of Stockholm. As they say here in Sweden, hej då, trevlig resa!